Hello, this is Aaron Wissner of Michigan, along with Nicole Foss from New Zealand. And this is the Deep Shock 2020. It is December the 7th. It's a Monday for me. It's Tuesday the 8th for Nicole. We have been talking a lot about the U.S. presidential election, Trump versus Biden, and all of the excitement for those who enjoy watching politics. In Michigan, I'm in Michigan. A few interesting things have happened over the last couple of weeks. First of all, the high schools and the colleges and the universities and the restaurants and all the indoor places have been closed. It was the 3-week pause. So there's a 3-week pause. And just today, the pause was extended until and through December the 20th. So no high schools can meet and colleges and universities. A couple funny things. Many of the restaurants in Michigan, it's getting colder. They wanted to have people seated outside, so they put these tents up. So the new rule from the Department of Health said, well, if it's mostly enclosed, then it counts as indoors. So they actually had defined that if it's mostly enclosed, it counts as indoors. It can't do that. Other things happening in Michigan, Rudy Giuliani, who is the lawyer for Trump, was here. He came to speak to the Republican legislators in a committee meeting. So the legislature in Michigan is Republican held, and a couple of the Republican leaders actually went and met with Trump in Washington, D.C. a week and a half ago. So Rudy Giuliani was here this past week, and he brought these people from Michigan that said they were witnesses, and their star witness was a person named Melissa Carone. She was hired to work for 2 days by a contractor. That contractor having been hired by one of the balloting companies like Dominion or something. So she worked for a couple of days for this contractor, and she then sat next to Rudy Giuliani, and the legislators from Michigan asked her questions about the ballots, and she claimed that the ballots were being run through multiple times without clearing the tabulator or something, and they were going in on the bottom, they were getting jammed, and they just kept going in. But she was so, she normally when you go in front of people in a legislature, you seem like you're very nicely, professionally dressed, and
she was drunk.
She appeared to be, yes. So Saturday Night Live, which is one of the big comedy shows, skit shows in the U.S., they did their cold open live, playing off Giuliani and Carone there. So, and then today, Giuliani, results are that he had a positive COVID test. Of course, it could be a false positive, but that means that the people who were in that hearing room might have been exposed to COVID due to him, the virus. I should be calling it the virus.
And he knew he had COVID, and he asked someone to take off their mask who was sitting right next to him.
Exactly. Yeah, I saw that. In other news in Michigan, because of the vote being certified for Biden, our Secretary of State here, apparently some people with signs and carrying guns were protesting outside her house, yelling something about that she was a Grinch, and her 4-year-old was inside, and she was not very happy about that. I'm sure the police were called to make sure they didn't do anything crazy. Michigan seems to be the hotbed of crazy sometimes. Lots of little things flying around the social media about Michigan judge says recount in Michigan. But of course, if you dig into the details, it's basically that way up in Antrim County, which accidentally counted the votes the wrong way for one day. Well, a tiny little village there called Central Lake, they were going to put in a marijuana distillery, and the number of votes was tied yes and no, which means it failed. And so they did a recount, and it passed by 1. And so now somebody said, well, we need to recount it again. So the judge said, yeah, you can recount those ballots again. But people are just saying, oh, Michigan's doing a recount or something, which is totally not right. And then the other big news in Michigan is Sidney Powell, who was kind of appeared to be the right-hand person of Rudy Giuliani for a while there. She was on the news a lot. She claimed that, again, the Dominion machines were they were switching ballot counts from Trump to Biden. They were subtracting Biden votes and subtracting Trump votes and adding Biden votes. Well, so she put this case in like a week ago called the Kraken case, as in like Clash of the Titans, the Kraken, from Greek mythology. She also put that in Georgia and a couple other states, and that was
been thrown out in Georgia. It's been thrown out from the bench. In other words, the judge didn't even have to think about it. He was absolutely scathing when he threw it out.
Yeah, and I read the better part of that. It's long, and it was filled with typos, the version I saw, and yeah, it was not convincing. So those are a few of the things going on in Michigan regarding this past election, but and regarding the COVID. But Nicole, how are things going in New Zealand? Because we haven't seen you for a couple of weeks. How are things going there? Are things all locked down?
Oh God, no. Everything is completely normal. It has been for months.
They haven't tried your doors closed or something there? Or?
No, absolutely nothing. I mean, we had I think, a 5 or 6 week lockdown initially. That got everything under control. And then we sort of gradually loosened up. And we were doing things like photographing the QR codes on doors of shops and things like that. So once the lockdown was over, that's really all we had to do. And sometimes they ask us to wear masks on public transport if there are 1 or 2 cases that have come into the country, because a lot of New Zealanders are returning. They're coming back to New Zealand, and some of them have COVID. They have a right to come here. So they go through the quarantine process. Occasionally mistakes are made. And there have been a couple of outbreaks since then in Auckland. And Auckland had just a local lockdown for a couple of weeks a while back. But really, almost nothing that interferes with daily life whatsoever. There still is going to be an economic price to pay here because the borders are closed, which means no tourism. And New Zealand is really dependent on tourists. It also is very much a farming and agricultural country. And we tend to bring in agricultural workers. And we can't really do that at the moment either. So there definitely is a problem. There aren't enough people to pick fruit and things. And there isn't the tourist money. The tourist resorts don't seem to be lowering their prices to the point where Kiwis can actually afford them, because so many of these tourist places, they're so expensive that it's really foreigners who are using these tourist places. Kiwis don't tend to go there themselves because it's expensive. Unless they lower the prices, then some of these places are going to go out of business. But on the whole, at the moment, there's very little impact. I do think we're in for harder times economically. There's a lot more government debt than there used to be. I mean, they've done a great job of supporting the economy through the period of COVID. Fortunately, when you do it right, it doesn't take that long. So it's not like you have to support everyone for a whole year. You maybe have to support them for a month or 6 weeks. And if you do the lockdown really hard, really early, and get all the cases under control, then things go back to normal and you don't have to be handing out stimulus payments constantly. So they gave people, I think it was 80% of their wages for the lockdown period. I mean, there are still problems. And it's harder for contractors to find work now than it used to be, I think. So there's the leading edge of economic problems. I do think they're going to get significantly worse over the next few years. Jacinda Ardern was recently reelected, but we have a 3-year election cycle. So she was recently elected for 3 years. I have a feeling that in that time, things are going to go badly wrong economically for no fault of the government's, just because it's baked in the cake at this point. And whoever's the leader will get blamed for that. So I'm not at all convinced that she would win another election. So I reckon we've got about 3 years before we have to deal with COVID and things, we deal with the pandemic. Because the National Party will open the borders if they get back into power. And then it will come in and we'll have to deal with it. But at least we will have better treatments by then. We'll know much more about how to deal with it. So I think that time lag will definitely help. But I do expect it to come here eventually. And at the moment, because we're basically isolated, it's difficult for it to come here, but we won't be isolated forever. I think there's going to be a lot of pressure to bring the tourists back, bring the agricultural workers back, and then we will have the pandemic the same as everybody else. But now, hopefully by then.
Are you guys going to be deploying the vaccine in a similar way to like the US and the UK?
Well, I would assume so. They'll be bringing it here. It would be unconstitutional to mandate it. And an awful lot of people are not going to take it, including me. So, there are issues with this particular vaccine, well, Pfizer and Moderna ones. They're mRNA vaccines. They're a different way of delivering a vaccine than normal. So they have to be kept at really cold temperatures, like liquid nitrogen type cold temperatures.
94 degrees Fahrenheit.
So yeah, I don't even know exactly what temperature they have to be held at, but it's not a normal temperature, shall we say. So human nature being what it is, I'm not convinced that it will always be correctly stored. And I haven't the faintest idea what the consequences of incorrect storage would be, whether it makes something worse or whether it would just mean it doesn't work at all. I haven't the faintest idea. But that's one concern. Also the fact that it's a very novel technology, mRNA vaccines. So this does not have a track record. And it has been put into practice very, very quickly, without any ability to look at long-term effects, because there hasn't been long enough to judge what effects there might be.
Was the last country that got enough for its population. You wouldn't be all that worried that you guys were last in line.
Oh, not at all. Personally, I wouldn't be remotely worried because I don't intend to take it ever, no matter when it comes. And I think there are a lot of people in that position, because it's really not necessary. I'm perfectly happy taking tons of vitamin D and zinc and selenium, things like that. I'm quite confident that I can get myself into a position where I don't think it would affect me terribly badly. And I would vastly rather do that with simple, cheap interventions than to take an untested treatment where there's not been any ability to judge whether there are long-term effects or not.
Well, at what point would you say, I think it's probably okay, and I mean, what would convince you, hey, I should go get this, my family should go get this?
Well, nothing really. We just won't be taking it. but I do understand that for other people, that is a question that you'd want to ask. Just because there are a lot of people who are not necessarily anti-vaccines in general. They just don't trust this one because it's novel and it's been rushed. And because Trump has been promoting it, and they automatically don't trust anything that comes out of Trump's mouth. So even although the Pfizer one, Trump had absolutely nothing to do with this, so it shouldn't be tainted by association with him, but nevertheless it is. So there are a lot of people who won't be taking it initially, but who will take it later on if they see that things are fine, nobody suffered, especially over the long term. Because it's really the long-term issues that could be a concern. But there seem to be short-term symptoms and things as well. And the testing they've done so far is mostly with completely healthy people. So what happens when you give this vaccine to people who are not so healthy, who already have, say, some of the preconditions that would make a severe case of the virus more likely? We don't know what effect it would have on people like that, because it's basically feeding them a part of the live virus. You could also end up with cross-reactivity issues. So the viral protein that's supposed to cause the reaction can resemble parts of the body, potentially. So these are the kind of long-term things. You don't want to cause autoimmune disease by giving a vaccine. There are a lot of things that I find, well, I wouldn't be happy about it. I mean, even if I didn't have the stance that I would never take it no matter what, even if I didn't have that, I would still have concerns. And I think other people have concerns as well. So I think it really is something that will just have to stand the test of time. Plenty of people are going to sign up for this right away. And some people have no choice anyway. Health professionals are very unlikely to have a choice. So if they want to keep working in healthcare, they will be taking it. And so we will end up with that long-term data. And that may well convince more people over time to decide to take it. There are too many things, in my view, that we just don't know. We don't know how long-term immunity will be. I think at the moment you need 2 shots. But if immunity doesn't last, you might need 2 shots every 6 months. And then that starts to get very expensive. Plus, if you are using adjuvants, and I do not know at this point whether they're using the same adjuvants for this kind of virus vaccine technology as they use for other ones. I honestly do not know that. If they are, then aluminum is toxic and bioaccumulative. And the more of it you inject, the more of it you build up in your body that's never going to go away. So if they use that adjuvant and you have to have frequent shots, then you would be risking bioaccumulation of aluminum. So that's simply a question I have, because I don't know the answer to that question, but I have many, many questions. So that's definitely one of them. The autoimmunity issue is another. There's also the potential for antibody-dependent enhancement. So there are some viruses where the second exposure is actually much more severe than the first, because what happens is the antibodies actually facilitate the entry of the virus into the cells of the immune system itself. So you actually get, like HIV and dengue fever, there are mechanisms in there that are not normally associated with coronaviruses that this virus seems to possess. So it's not clear yet whether there might be the potential for a vaccine to actually prime the immune system to give you a worse case of COVID than you would otherwise have had. This is a possibility. It is that way for SARS-1. That does have that effect. And there are similarities. So that's another major question that I would have.
So I imagine
I would like to see these questions answered.
So I imagine a lot of people will be having questions, wondering about the vaccine. And I imagine there'll be a good number who will be taking kind of a backseat approach and let's see how things go. In the US, the mainstream media has been very, very positive, touting the 94.5% effectiveness rate and those sorts of things. The CDC in the US, I believe, said that it's going to be the healthcare workers and the nursing home residents who are the first to get the doses, even though there have been some people that have said, wait a second, what about the prison guards? I mean, wouldn't it make sense, because you're trying to protect the prisoners from the virus getting in, and there have been outbreaks in prisons, and how about the healthcare workers who work at the nursing care homes? Maybe they should be before.
Grocery store clerks.
Right.
Grocery store clerks are massively exposed.
It's kind of interesting. There's a lot of discussion about it, and there are lots of other channels where people are talking about the pros and the cons, and some people are medical experts and some people aren't. I'd like to turn a little bit to the presidential transition in the US. So we have Biden got his first security briefing today, I believe. The GSA administrator allowed him, to the transition to begin maybe a week or so ago. But there's lots of stuff going on. So there's a protest about the pipeline going through Minnesota from Canada, from the tar sands to Lake Superior. And there was another African-American shot in the back yesterday by a police officer. There's the federal
walking into his own home.
There's a federal death row execution schedule, and it's being accelerated. People are being put on the schedule so that they're executed before Inauguration Day. Apparently, Biden at the moment is against federal executions, even though in the past at some point he voted for a bill that added things to the capital offenses in the US, various different kinds of murder as being capital offenses, plus treason and espionage. Let's see, Alaska oil drilling, apparently leases are being created, and the Trump campaign.
In the wildlife reserve.
Apparently the Trump.
All of this is being pushed through.
The Trump campaign apparently has collected another 100 million of donations, over 100 million in donations after the election.
Since October, he has raked in about $420 million from his supporters, which coincidentally is about the amount of outstanding personally guaranteed debt that he was carrying So he's fleecing his supporters. So these legal cases that are going on now, they're one for 46 or 47, and the only one they won was trivial anyway, that didn't have any real effect. These cases are an absolute joke. They're a complete waste of the court's time. The only reason that they're doing this, they know perfectly well they can't win. They're doing it to create the impression that they're fighting a winnable fight and using it as a grift. They're using it as a fundraising tactic. So the people who are conducting this are laughable. Giuliani hadn't been in court since 1992, and it showed. He managed to confuse Article 2 with the Second Amendment, for one thing. No lawyer worth his salt should ever do that. Jenna Ellis is a souped-up traffic court lawyer. Sidney Powell is an insane QAnon supporter. Lynn Wood is also an absolute insane QAnon guy. And these court cases are going nowhere. They don't even allege fraud in court because there are penalties for lying in court. So they go into court and they say this isn't a fraud case, but they go on the media and say, oh, there's fraud absolutely everywhere. There is not fraud absolutely everywhere. They are making this up out of whole cloth. They are just parading the most ridiculous group of people as supposed witnesses. They must think their supporters are extremely stupid, because there's no other way they could think that people would fall for this.
Well, and that
unfortunately, people are falling for it.
Well, that really draws to the forefront Georgia, especially because in Georgia there's these two Senate elections. So there's a Republican versus a Democrat, and another Republican versus another Democrat. And so right now there have been 50 Republicans elected already, 48 Democrats already elected, and there's these two seats up. So the question is, you know, if the two Democrats are elected, then it'll be a divided Senate, but then the vice president will come in and break any ties. So it'll be democratically controlled. But if either one or both of these Republican senators are elected, then then it will remain in Republican hands, except for, you know, something as, you know, there are a few centrist Republicans, like Snow from, is it Snow from Maine? I can't remember which one it is. But anyway, so Trump went there over the weekend, this past weekend. The candidates, the Republican candidates, were on stage for 2 or 3 minutes, and the crowd was just clearing, "Go Trump, go, go Trump, go," or something like that. And then he spoke for 80 minutes or an hour, 2 hours, something about election fraud. So the question is, you know, is he really helping?
No, he's not.
Or is he just helping himself?
He doesn't actually care whether they win or not. He's not a Republican. He's not even a conservative. He has no loyalty to the Republican Party, and he thinks they didn't support him enough. So, I mean, all he ever cares about is his own personal grievances, and he has a grievance with the Republican Party right now. It wouldn't surprise me at all if he sabotaged their election. and that would actually be a very good thing, because then you would have a democratically controlled Senate. And if you don't have a democratically controlled Senate, well, having the presidency and a tiny majority in the House will not really allow Biden to do absolutely anything. McConnell will block every single thing. So not just McConnell, Lindsey Graham, who's on Judiciary Committee, he just came out and said the Senate will not confirm any attorney general who will investigate or prosecute Trump. So they're saying Trump must be above the law, or we won't approve anyone. They're not going to allow Biden to pick his own cabinet. So the only way he'll be able to have a cabinet is by acting ministers. And then they'll say, oh, you're going above the Constitution. But I mean, this is what Mitch McConnell did the last time. He did this to Barack Obama for 8 solid years, just completely shut down almost everything he tried to do. And then Obama had to do things by executive order. And then he was told he was doing overreach. It's ridiculous. They do not allow Democrats to do anything. Mitch McConnell has blocked every single thing that would have benefited ordinary Americans ever since he has been in charge of the Senate. He is the Grim Reaper. He's absolutely evil, and he's also bought and paid for by the Chinese. I mean, his wife is very well connected to the Chinese Communist Party. It's just ridiculous, the level of corruption that's there. But really, the Senate does matter absolutely enormously here. But I'm really concerned about the level of misinformation that's getting out there. It's not just that Trump is going on and on and on and on and on and on about election fraud, but he's encouraging other people to do a tour of the country, setting up sort of groups, meetings and things talking about election fraud. So he's deputizing umpteen other people to basically go around the country and push this line. What it's doing is creating a situation where half the country will never regard Biden as a legitimate president. There have already been sheriff's offices that have said they will not impose certain rules at the state level. So, for instance, in California, they will not impose lockdown rules. They will not enforce them. The same sort of thing will happen to Biden. So he's going to find that in theory he's president, but Republican governors are already saying they're just not going to listen to him. And what are you going to do? I mean, you can send things to the Supreme Court, which is thoroughly stacked for Republicans. You can't necessarily guarantee you're going to get any joy from doing that. So I think there's a huge, huge problem. Some of the Republicans, I think, are starting to realize that, particularly Raffensperger in Georgia and Brian Kemp, also in Georgia, because both of them being absolutely demonized. I mean, the MAGA people are calling for them to be executed for treason, just for following the law. So I think they're starting to think, maybe there's a problem here. But Raffensperger still supports the two Republican candidates in Georgia for the Senate, despite the fact that both of them have said he was absolutely up to no good and he should be fired and thrown out of the party. You know, he still supports them. This is really sad. Stockholm syndrome. But this is going on a lot. It's going on all over the country. They haven't had violence yet, but that's because the MAGA people don't think he's lost. So they're still thinking they're fighting the good fight, and they're just waiting for the outcome of the legal cases that they think are going to be successful. They just think he's going to get this up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court will hand in the election. And until that has a chance to play out differently, they're still going to believe it. This is why there hasn't been widespread violence yet. But the closer we get to the point where it is going to be obvious to them that Biden will be inaugurated, the more likely violence is. So the safe harbor date is the 8th for all the states to have certified the election. Then on the 14th of December, the Electoral College will vote. At that point, Biden will be confirmed as the president-elect. I have seen some indications that they're planning something very disruptive on December 12th. Street violence and things like that. That was a little while ago that they were planning that. I don't know whether they are still planning that, but it's possible. I don't think they want the Electoral College to be able to vote. And then there are other dates into January as well before the inauguration. But I think what is going on at the moment is really insidious. It's trying to destroy the very idea of liberal democracy, to make it seem like you can never have a free and fair election, that everybody cheats, so of course you have to cheat in retaliation. That's exactly what they're setting up here, the mythology of a stolen election, so that now, at the next election, the Republicans might be able to cheat absolutely openly, and their side will have nothing to say about it, because what they'll say is, oh, well, the Democrats stole the last one. And that's not even remotely true, but that's the myth that they're setting up that is setting the US still on the path to fascism at the next election, because the next fascist leader will not be an incompetent buffoon who telegraphs everything he's going to do far enough in advance that people can figure out ways to block it. He's not self-disciplined enough, and he's far too much of a coward to be a proper dictator. The next one won't have those flaws. So America has, at best, 4 years to try and deal with this situation before you end up with another fascist. And it's going to be difficult because they're not going to want anyone to look into Trump's criminality. And the way they've set this up, he's been hollering Russian hoax and witch hunts and things ever since he was elected. Can you imagine what's going to happen when they actually arrest him and read out a list of charges as long as your arm? It's just going to seem like a political witch hunt. It absolutely isn't. He could be charged with 13 felonies, hundreds and hundreds of felonies. Every now and then I sort of list off all the things that any prosecutor worth his salt could charge and convict Trump on tomorrow. It's a list as long as your arm, and that's just what publicly known. He needs to be prosecuted for all of it. If he isn't, he will continue to own the Republican Party. He'll continue to drag them along the line to fascism, and it won't be him who comes back in 2024, I think. I think it'll be a far more competent fascist, but he will have laid the groundwork for it. That's what he's doing right now. He thinks he's doing it for himself for 2024. Personally, I think the odds of him still even being alive by 2024 are not that high. I mean, he's 74 now. I think he's 78, and he's a long-term drug addict. His health is bad. It's been deteriorating, obviously, over the last 4 years. But more than that, I think he's become such a pain in the neck to his own side that they might just decide to take him out themselves because they want to put the competent fascist in there. And if Trump is an obstacle to that, they might just decide that he'd be more useful to them as a martyr than as a living human being. And it wouldn't surprise me whatsoever if that happened. So you have to think like a Machiavellian. To think the way these people work, you have to imagine for a moment that you have no conscience, no empathy. You will do anything to maintain power. You have to maintain loyalty of a small group of people, and you can't trust anybody else. And you only trust people you have compromat on, because that's how the mob does it. They all have compromat on each other, and so they all sink or swim together. This is exactly the kind of administration Trump has set up because he's been mobbed for years, so that's how he works. This kind of scenario is a disaster for the United States. It needs to be nipped in the bud. Well, it's really too late for that, but it still needs to be stopped if at all possible. It's just going to be very politically difficult to do it. Now, in Italy, Silvio Berlusconi, who was pretty similar to Trump in terms of psychology, not as bad, but similar, he didn't have nuclear weapons or anything like that. So he wasn't able to pose the same level of threat that Trump could potentially pose, but he had the same kind of psychology. He was voted out, and 2 years later, he was voted back in again because they hadn't dealt with his criminality. So the people who were voting for him didn't know that he'd committed all these crimes. They had never been told. And the people who took over from Berlusconi never really pointed this out, never had him prosecuted for any of the things he did wrong. So everyone thought, oh, well, we'll have him back again. And that is possible. Really, for the kind of things that have happened under this administration, the Republican Party should be out of power for a generation at least. In fact, the Republican Party itself should completely collapse, and a new conservative party would be out of power for a generation. That would be if there was still a shared reality in the country, if the people who are supporting Trump actually knew what he's been doing, but they don't, because they're part of the right-wing media ecosystem. They never hear about any of this. All they hear about is Trump is such a hero, and Trump has done this, and Trump has done that. They never hear about any of the criminal activity. And all the things that he's being pumped up for are false. So they just have a completely incorrect impression of the last 4 years. So if there is no prosecution, they will never know all these things that have happened. And then it's quite likely that he or somebody else, Don Jr. maybe, could be voted back in. Personally, I think the donor class would not want any Trumps anywhere near power ever again, because the donor class is just interested in an economy that makes them rich. And a chaotic, collapsing economy is not one that will make anybody rich. So, well, billionaires, it does make some people rich. It's made Jeff Bezos a lot richer and Elon Musk, but they're only the very few. I think the regular donor class would just like to see the economy absolutely humming, so they want a competent fascist for that. And Trump is just too chaotic. They don't know what he's going to do. They don't know what apple carts he's going to overturn on any given day. And Don Jr., in some ways, would be even worse. He's not intelligent at all. He's also a drug addict. He's also a fascist. He's also incompetent. So I'm not convinced they would want him around either. So it depends. But I really think this setup for fascism that's been going on since the election is very dangerous. So it's still an attempted coup. I think at this point it has no chance of actually working. but it is generating huge amounts of money, and it is absolutely undermining liberal democracy, because the Republican Party, very, very few of them have criticized Trump for this. They are fine with undermining democracy. That's the real danger here. Not so much what Trump is doing himself, but the fact that 70-something million people are still supporting fascism over democracy and are perfectly happy with elections being stolen by Republicans, overturned if possible. I don't think they will be overturned, but that's what these people are asking for. They're asking for governors and legislatures to overturn elections in the face of a clear victory for the opponent. And once you get that kind of mindset going, it's very, very difficult to ever have a free and fair election again. And I think the only way would be to go back to absolutely secure paper ballots only. Get rid of all the voting machines, have paper, hand-marked paper ballots with a clear paper trail, and then it would be much harder to engage in fraud. But the way it is now with these voting machines, there are all sorts of issues with voting machines. And I'm not looking at Dominion here, I'm looking at ES&S. They have the majority of the market. They are GOP-owned. They are GOP donors. These machines are connected to the internet. And I think there's so much going on with the presidential election that nobody's really looking down ballot. Personally, I'd like to know how Mitch McConnell won by 10 points when he's never cracked a 30% approval rating. And I'm supposed to believe he won counties he never won before, even although his approval rating has fallen? I don't think so. But the fact that there's so much going on at the presidential level means that there's so many allegations of fraud that everyone who's trying to say, no, there wasn't fraud in the presidential election, now has to say, just no, there was no fraud. Personally, I think there probably was, and it was on behalf of the Republicans. Of course, there's no way to prove any of that, but it makes an awful lot of sense. If you look at the close Senate races, every single close contested Senate race went Republican, in enormous contrast to the polls. Just enormous contrast. It wasn't even close what the election turned out to be compared to what the polls were saying that it would be. For them to have won all those down ballot races, I think there's some serious explaining to do there. But nobody's going to look at it because of all the attention purely on the presidential race. Those Senate races were very important because they are what gives Mitch McConnell the ability to block absolutely everything a Democratic president would want to do. So I really think that all those voting machines need to go. They are connected to the internet. People say they're not, but they are. Jennifer Cohn on Twitter is the one to follow. She's a lawyer, and so her election security is her thing. She has been shouting from the rooftops about this for 4 solid years. And there's proven fraud with these ES&S machines, just as there was with Diebold machines. They are hackable. The Diebold machines were hackable by an 11-year-old in 10 minutes. So, and they've even admitted that these machines were hacked in 2016. What hasn't been made clear is whether or not anything was changed as a result. It's quite possible that it wasn't. It's quite possible that it was just let's see if we can get into these machines because it might be useful later on. It's entirely possible that's all that happened in 2016. There's no way to tell. But I think the United States must go back to hand-marked paper ballots if it ever wants to have a free and fair election again. And it needs to restore the Voting Rights Act, because as soon as that dropped, all of a sudden you could intimidate people at the polls again. And that's exactly what it was brought in to prevent. And because it had prevented it reasonably well, people thought, oh, well, there's no need for that anymore. So they let it expire. And now there's intimidation at the polls again. I think Americans should be far more concerned than they are with the fact that, for instance, plots to capture and potentially execute the governor of Michigan, plots to burn down the Michigan Capitol with people inside. These are very real criminal plots. This is exactly the kind of thing that's coming out of MAGA world right now. And if that doesn't concern Americans, then they're sleepwalking, and that's very dangerous. There's also been a huge change of personnel at the Pentagon. So there's a major arms deal that's going through with the UAE at the moment. This is all to prevent any scrutiny of that arms deal, to push all this through. I still think Trump is quite likely going to start a war with Iran during the lame duck period, because he's basically bought and paid for by the Saudis, the Russians, and the UAE. The Saudis, the UAE, and Israel all want a war with Iran. Trump owes them a war because they bailed him out umpteen times. They helped him. They interfered with the election. So, and Egypt as well. There was all the Middle East was basically trying to get Trump into power in 2016 with money, with various kinds of interference. He owes them a war, and I think it's quite possible that they will get the war that they want. So changing all the personnel at the Pentagon is part of that. But it's also about giving Eric Prince free reign in Africa. So Eric Prince lives in the UAE, where I think Trump, if Trump decides to leave the country, I think he'll end up living in the UAE. And Eric Prince is already based there, and he's completely unaccountable. The troops are being withdrawn from theater. American troops are being withdrawn from Somalia, for instance. But it's not that they're going home. They're just being, the ones from Somalia are just being moved next door to Kenya. They're being replaced by Eric Prince's mercenaries, so that the entire thing can be conducted without accountability, because these are not official troops. So Eric Prince is being given free reign in Africa. He will end up being given free reign in the Middle East if Trump has anything to say about it as well. It's about privatizing war for profit, war for personal gain, not war for any kind of national interest whatsoever. There really aren't national interests that are involved there. And you could argue that it was a national interest in terms of ensuring oil supplies, but that's really not what this is about. This is about trying to contain Iran and Shia Islam in general. So the United States has come down on the side of the Sunnis in the Muslim schism. So Sunni, Shia, it's a bit like Catholic and Protestant in Ireland 300 years ago. There's a sectarian divide. The United States has come down on one side of that sectarian divide against the other, and never take sides in somebody else's civil war, even, and especially not if it's over a religious schism that has nothing to do with you whatsoever. It's just, it's ridiculous what's going on.
Now, I'm wondering,
but I do think these changes are significant.
With Eric Prince and, well, I had two thoughts going through there. First, we've got Eric Prince, who has his mercenary corporation, Blackwater, or whatever it's called now. And then we have, I'm thinking back to European history in the 1920s, when there were so many men in Germany after World War I who had been soldiers, but the armistice, I think, required that their fighting force had to be reduced almost to nothing, like 100,000 people or something. But there were all these men that needed something to do, and there were folks like, I don't know, Himmler or something, and they kind of organized them into the SS, the stormtroopers, the brown shirts, I guess they were called.
The brown shirts were the SA. That was the precursor to the SS.
And so, but it makes me wonder, what if the U.S. was to go down that sort of a path? It seems like the extremists, the MAGA extremists, the national extremists, would need to actually be organized in some manner, like they were during the 20s of Germany.
Yeah, and Hitler was very organized in that way. So if you look at the SS, it's absolutely regimented, like just as orderly as you could possibly imagine. Whereas, can you imagine Trump creating anything orderly ever? Definitely not. He's an agent of utter chaos. I mean, this is why he's not as successful as a dictator doing things like this. So his version of the SS is like CBP, the Border Patrol, and ICE, and a bunch of prison guards, and a few police unions. This is not remotely comparable to what the SS was. This is not a disciplined force of any kind, but they are loyal to him personally, which the military would not be. The military are loyal to the Constitution. The military have already told him to get lost, that they will not come out for him. And they actually despise him, and rightly so, because he called their fallen suckers and losers. So he was never going to get any military support for a coup. But he does have his shock troops. They're the people who were shoving people into unmarked vans in Portland, for instance. And Eric Prince's people were there too. Blackwater was even selling T-shirts saying about Portland burning over the summer. You could literally buy T-shirts from Blackwater about Portland burning. And it's just ridiculous what's going on. So he does have people who are loyal to him personally. They're just not a disciplined kind of force. They would just be agents of chaos as well. So what you would get under those circumstances would look a lot more like anarchy, I think, because you'd have those people, then you'd have the backlash, you'd have Antifa, and you would have people on both sides, and there would be street battles and things. So I don't think it would look like Nazi Germany. But my concern, if there's a more competent fascist in 2024, is you could end up looking exactly like Nazi Germany, because that's the sort of thing a competent fascist would do. So Josh Hawley, Tom Cotton, people like that, these are the kind of people who would come in, and they wouldn't sound all rough around the edges, and they wouldn't be abusing Gold Star families. They would sound smooth and polished, but they would still be fascists. These are the kind of people that you really have to worry about. And unfortunately, the stage is being set to give them a base. That's really the problem. They will have a base ready-made for 2024 that will expect them to cheat to win and will back them to the hilt when they do. And people will probably blame Biden for what's going to happen over the next 4 years. He won't be able to accomplish anything because he will be blocked at every turn. I'm not convinced the Democrats will win those Georgia runoffs. And if they don't, then there's no way to prevent him from doing that. A runoff election in Georgia in January is not normally good news for Democrats. It is possible that they might win them just because everything is so screwed up this year. And Trump was telling people not to vote, and people might write in Trump instead of either of the two candidates. So who knows? He might get Senate control. Even then, it'll be marginal because he'd have like a one seat majority in the House, I think it is, and Kamala Harris having to be the tiebreaker in the Senate. It doesn't take many defections to prevent people from being able to accomplish anything. And if you can't accomplish anything, if you make a lot of promises and you get in there and you can't accomplish anything, then people blame you for failure and they say, well, you're just really hapless and we'll vote for somebody else. And there only is one other party to vote for. So my concern really now is to do with the rise of illiberalism and anti-democratic sentiment in regard to what's going to come down the line in 2024. And in fact, it might even hit sooner than that, because if the Democrats lose their House majority in 2022, they will impeach Biden almost instantly. They will come up with some pretext, they will impeach him, and they will just drag him through the mud and make it impossible for him to get absolutely anywhere. And that is so, so profoundly sad. But I'm very concerned with the direction the US is going. It flirted with fascism in the 30s. It almost came in the war on the side of Germany in World War II. There were a lot of people who would have wanted to see America do that. Charles Lindbergh, Henry Ford, these people were fascists back then. And so there is a background to this. And there's also, the system is set up for white minority rule. It was set up deliberately that way by the founding fathers. So the idea was to make sure that you had to have a stake in something. So landed white men who owned land would be able to vote. The franchise has been expanded, but because the franchise is now universal, they're trying to maintain white minority rule by preventing minorities from voting in umpteen different ways, voter suppression of all kinds, psyops to prevent them from wanting to vote. So this is really problematic. So America's shadow is white minority rule and fascism. In Jungian terms, you have the main part of your personality and your shadow. And maturity is about integrating your shadow, understanding your shadow and integrating it into your overall personality in order to control it. America never did that as a nation. So instead of dealing with its shadow, it suppressed it, pretended it didn't exist, and then elected it. So this is the problem. America has elected its shadow. It has put in power all the worst things that were ever part of America and put them in power. And this is why it's so extremely dangerous what's happening now. Because once you get power, you can create the ability to give yourself more power by making it much, much harder for the opposition to ever come back from their deficits. You can get in there, gerrymander everything. There's so many things the Democrats would need to do to have a fighting chance. They would need to make DC and Puerto Rico states, for instance. They would have to combat gerrymandering and voter suppression. But if you don't have much in the way of room to move, because you have very little in the House and maybe not the Senate at all, how do you do any of those things? You can't. So then that just means you're at an even bigger structural disadvantage next time. And this is a huge problem. And I actually think the next 10 years in America are probably not going to be 10 years that you're going to want to remember. And I do think it will be at least that long. And the politics is absolutely part of it. The politics of division and chaos and hate, which have been absolutely stoked over the last 4 years, that's a huge part of it. But there's also everything that was coming anyway with limits to growth. So this is a huge part of the problem. It's not just that they're having this political conniption right now. It's that it's happening at a time when globally we were reaching limits to growth anyway. So there were already problems that were baked in the cake to do with financial crisis and energy crisis and climate and all these sorts of issues. All these issues were baked in the cake long before Trump came along. None of them have been addressed at all. In fact, every single one of them has been made drastically worse during the Trump administration. So this administration has actually pushed things much further along the line into contraction than would have happened naturally. So we've been pushed a lot further into the psychology of contraction, a lot further into polarization and hate and division than you would normally expect after only such a short time from a top. And also, I mean, the just gay abandon of drill, baby, drill, and burn this, and throw out all the regulations that would have tried to tamp things down a little bit. Getting rid of all that has just pushed everything even further into limits to growth. So now we're all going to have to deal with all of it. And it's not just an American issue for this. This is global. And even the American politics issue is going global through QAnon, because QAnon is in 75 countries. It's huge in Germany, Japan, the UK. It's big in Australia. It's here. You know, it's a live action role play game. So what QAnon does is it doesn't just tell you a story. It plants breadcrumbs. And you think that you're connecting the dots for yourself, even although those dots have been very carefully placed for you to take you down a particular rabbit hole. But people think that they have connected the dots themselves. So they own it in a much deeper way than they would if they had just been told something. They really feel that they have managed to discover the secret behind all the corruption of global politics, that all these liberal elites are eating babies. And I mean that literally. That is what they think. They think that there's something called adrenochrome in the adrenal glands of babies that gives you eternal life. And they think that liberal politicians and Hollywood elite are eating babies for this reason. And they think there are huge tunnels drilled all over the earth, down to Antarctica, for instance, and that trafficked children are being held in these tunnels by these liberal elites. It's insane. Like, insane doesn't even begin to describe the level of batshit craziness that QAnon involves. But people sincerely believe this. And because it's isolated and internally reinforcing, people just don't get out of the bubble. It's like a cult. It's very much like the Moonies or Jonestown or, any of these death cults and things that were around the last time we had a bear market. So all this stuff that came out in the 70s, all these cults, this was the same kind of psychology. That's the psychology of contraction, where you start to get cults and paranoia. And there were even court cases over satanic abuse in the 80s that came out of stuff that was in the 70s. So the psychology came out of the 70s, but even into the 80s, there were court cases over this stuff. There was never any basis to any of it, but it started to get taken more and more and more seriously. So at the next election, you might find that it's not the Democrats versus the Republicans, it's the Democrats versus QAnon. QAnon is taking over the Republican Party, and not just the Republican Party in America, but in many other parts of the world as well. Conservatism is being drawn into QAnon because they're playing on the fear and the paranoia. Conservatism tends to involve more of a heightened perception of threat, for instance. Liberals have a lower perception of threat. They tend to see opportunity Conservatives tend to see threats under the same set of circumstances. So if you can play on the fears of conservatives and draw them down this incredibly dark rabbit hole, then you can completely subvert conservatism in general. Now, I don't have a problem with conservatism as it used to be practiced. I'm not a conservative myself, but I do think it's absolutely essential that a country have a balance of liberals and conservatives, and that people, both sides, have a voice in a competitive system, because that is the only thing that will ever give you political legitimacy. Everyone has to feel heard. Everyone has to feel that they can vote for what they want, and sometimes they'll get in power, maybe sometimes they won't, but they will have faith in the system that delivers a leader. So if their side loses, they will accept that. If you have that kind of balanced system that enjoys political legitimacy, then that's how you get stability. So I'm not by any stretch of the imagination saying that we should get rid of conservatism, that conservatism is the problem. It's not. Sane conservatism is not the problem, any more than sane liberalism is the problem. It's the insane ones on both extremes that are the problem. And right now, the insanity is vastly biased towards the far right, just vastly. I mean, there are, the left wing will conduct purity tests and things like that. And I have no time for that sort of thing whatsoever. I think it's ridiculous. I think you absolutely need to have the biggest possible tent at the moment. If you're going to defeat fascism, like, even within the Democratic Party, you can't have people saying, oh, well, I'm a Sanders person or I'm a Biden person, I would never vote for the other side. And I'd say, no, you need to take in the Lincoln Project. You need the Never Trumpers. You need everyone that isn't fascist on your side. And you do not want to split them into factions and camps and have them fighting against each other, because otherwise the fascists will win at the next election. So I'm trying to encourage them to build the biggest possible tent of sane individuals, because that's really all you have that will stand against fascism in the future. And I am so concerned with the rise of fascism worldwide. And it's just in so many places at the moment. I mean, the US is going that way. Brazil already has, Russia has, India, China. These are not small players. These major players, many of them have nuclear weapons, and they're going fascist and strongly nationalist. This is extremely dangerous. I mean, what's happening in India is absolutely tragic. And Modi is blaming the pandemic on the Muslims, for instance. There are hundreds of millions of Muslims in India. They've lived there for hundreds of years. And they're finding their shops are being burned out. They're being beaten in the streets. The kind of stuff that is just absolutely appalling. And Narendra Modi is absolutely encouraging that at every step. It's Hindutva fascism, Hindutva extremism that's being imposed on a country of 1.3 billion people. And oh, I hate to think what's going to happen to India. And they are not going to have the water to grow the crops to feed those people. And with that many people, that concentrated, and that level of inequality, which is vastly worse than the inequality in the States or Britain or anywhere else in the West, that's a recipe for just a complete national meltdown. So I really worry about what's happening there. But fascism in general is getting footholds in many, many, many places. And various leaders who are wannabe fascists are watching how Trump did it. So the one thing that Trump is extremely good at is manipulating people. So he will find weaknesses and exploit them. He will lie to people's faces in a way that convinces them, and he will spin a web of lies that convince people. He will deploy social media to back up those lies at every stage. And all sorts of other people around the world are going, oh, that's how it's done. Well, we'll do that too. And they already are. Brexit was part of the same dynamic. It's let's destroy the West. Let's bring the West down because we don't like liberal democracy. It stands in the way of fascism. And that's a real concern. So I don't know how many people have read Ayn Rand, but Fountainhead, I believe, not that I've read it, but I know of it roughly. It was about basically the rich people taking off and leaving the rest behind and saying, well, let's just throw off the useless people in the population. And they were actually going to another planet, I believe, or something like that anyway. And in this case, nobody's going to another planet, but I can imagine them building armored green zones and leaving the rest of the planet as chaotic red zones, things like that. So it's a similar dynamic in a way. There isn't going to be enough to go around. The pie will be shrinking. So the people at the top will grab as much of the remaining wealth pie as they possibly can while they can, and just beggar everybody else. And then they'll be living in gilded prisons, because you don't last very long unless you have very high walls and lots of guards, if you've just done that to the entire population of the world. I don't think they're thinking ahead very far. So they're thinking, well, let's grab all the wealth. I don't think they're thinking about what happens next. They're not going to like it. So over the full period of contraction, the people who think they're going to wall themselves off are just going to get dragged down into the mud with everybody else. It will take a bit longer, but you end up with much greater equality at the bottom. So these huge swings of expansion and contraction, you have wealth concentration and concentration towards the top, and as it starts to go down the other side, but then it all falls apart and you get equality, but at a very low level. And then the whole thing starts again. So this is really the cyclical nature of human history. That's the way history has played out, with the rise and fall of empire, for instance, and the shift of hegemonic power from one place to the next. This is just the way human history has always worked. It just so happens that the larger the upward swing, the larger the downward swing. So the bigger the contraction. The contraction is proportionate to the period of expansion that preceded it. And in this case, that was the biggest period of expansion in human history. So we really can expect some pretty negative things to happen on the downslope of that. And that is going to be global. So that's not just a US thing at all. I mean, my concern with the US is that they seem to be in some ways leading the charge towards fascism and showing other people how to do it. And they have nuclear weapons. Plus, the US was really the major leader of Western liberal democracy. And so bringing down the US and trying to push that into fascism will leave the other smaller players much more vulnerable to the same kind of thing. So I think in Europe, for instance, you're seeing a lot of this now. Brexit is in 20 days, I think. There's no deal. So this is going to hurt like crazy in the UK. It's quite possible Hungary and Poland will be the next ones out the door, because they're refusing to follow the European rules. Both those countries are going fascist. Orban in Hungary is already ruling by decree as a dictator. Poland is imposing laws that are seeing millions and millions of people out in the streets. So I think that the law that people are protesting in Poland at the moment is actually an abortion law. Abortion is already illegal in Poland, but what they're trying to do is take away any of the exceptions. So for instance, if you happen to have an ectopic pregnancy, well, that's it, you die. I mean, a simple operation would cure that, but they count it as an abortion, so you're not allowed to have one. And what about incest and rape and all these other things, or various problems that people have that require that kind of treatment? I mean, what if the mother has sky-high blood pressure, preeclampsia? She is going to die if she doesn't have a cesarean section or an abortion, depending on what stage of things. But, you know, it gets to the point where the lives of women don't really matter anymore. That's really the problem with these abortion laws, and not just in Poland, but everywhere. They're about controlling women. They're not about preventing abortion. If they really were pro-life, they would actually care what happens to the children after they're born, and they obviously don't. So there's nothing to do with pro-life to do with this. They're also the same people who would promote the death penalty and call themselves pro-life. I have ridicule for these people. But in Poland, they just got rid of every exception. And so there are literally millions of people on the streets in Poland. There are also millions of people on the streets in Belarus, because Alexander Lukashenko stole the election there. Despite losing in a landslide, he's refusing to leave. So people have been on the streets for months in Belarus. Things are going badly wrong in Europe. And I think it's going to tear apart the fabric of the European Union, probably sooner rather than later. And I think Hungary and Poland will be leaving with no deal as well at some point in the not too distant future. It starts to get to the point where it's just going to tear itself apart at the seams. So I think in Europe, you're looking at balkanization. I mean, there are housing bubbles everywhere in Europe. Those are going to crash. Freedom of movement will be a thing of the past. And that's going to leave a whole lot of people stranded in places that they've lived for a long time, but they no longer have the right to live in. This is already happening with Brexit. It's tearing families apart. And there's tragic, tragic stories of marriage is breaking down. One partner has to move back to the continent, and the whole family is torn apart over things like this. It's just been absolutely ghastly, and there will be no upside to it. Absolutely none. So, Boris Johnson was thinking, oh, this will give us the freedom to negotiate a really good trade deal with Donald Trump. And, well, that's not happening. So, and it wouldn't have been a good thing for Britain even if it had. Trump would have absolutely screwed Britain over because he doesn't regard there being any win-win situations. For Trump, any negotiation must end in a win-lose situation where he is the winner. So his idea is to rub the nose of his counterpart in their failure to gain any of the things that they wanted out of the negotiations. So this would not have gone well for Britain anyway. But I'm really concerned about Britain in particular. I think there could be utter chaos in Britain as a result of Brexit. Brexit was bought and paid for by the same people that interfered on behalf of Trump. So Aaron Banks and Carol Cadwalader has been following this just to the nth degree. She's a journalist in the UK, so you can follow her on Twitter if you want to know everything you could possibly want to know about Brexit and who funded it and how they did things illegally and all this sort of detail. But it's going to be a big problem, and the housing bubble in the UK is insane. So something is going to prick that bubble, and then an awful lot of people are going to be in negative equity. And that's going to be a problem everywhere. It's very much going to be a problem here, by the way, because New Zealand has one of the largest property bubbles on the face of the earth. If the average house in Auckland is well over $1 million, I've seen things in the area around where we live, where they'd be selling a tumble down 2-bedroom clapboard granny flat for $600,000. This is just insane. People cannot afford this. And so when that bubble bursts, we are going to have an absolute rash of negative equity as well. And it won't just be the housing market. That one of the biggest problems facing New Zealand will be that it's totally over-invested in dairy. We supply about 1/3 of all the dairy products on the face of the earth. And this is a small country. It's overbuilt. It is put in inappropriate places where it's destroying the soil, over-compacting the soil. It's polluting the water. So dairying, because it's overbuilt, what will happen is all of it will be operating marginally at the same time. And the price of milk has fallen. This is making it even more marginal. So what we have here is something called Fonterra, which is supposed to be a farmer's co-op. So everyone sells their milk to Fonterra, and then Fonterra sells it on out of the country. Well, Fonterra is probably going to go bankrupt, and it's going to take the dairy industry down with it. And when it does, the price of rural land in New Zealand will absolutely crater because all the dairy farms will go out of business at the same time. And the way governments tend to deal with that is they tend to sell it off in blocks, and my guess is they'll sell it to the Chinese. So I think China is flexing its muscles right now, and that this is going to be a problem for this part of the world. And China has been basically trying to give America enough rope to hang itself. So they don't want to face America right now. They would much rather face a weakened enemy. So put Donald Trump in power, let him wreck the country, and then maybe do something. I don't think they're going to take America on directly, though. But what they are doing is pushing their power in their own sphere of influence. So they're not taking on America, but right now they are taking on Australia. So Australia has been talking about human rights in China, and China has said, oh yeah, well, we're just not going to accept any of your imports anymore. And Australia is unbelievably dependent on China for everything. China is about to show Australia who is boss. There are something like 80 coal barges, these great big tanker trucks, boats rather, that sitting outside Chinese ports. They're not allowed to dock. Perishable goods as well are not being allowed to dock, so they're going to being spoiled. So China is basically trying to say to America, or to Australia, do as we say. You have no choice because we're more powerful than you. They haven't taken on New Zealand in the same way. New Zealand is much smaller, so we're much less of a target anyway. But I think they will do the same thing to us. So I think we will be under Chinese hegemony. And China is the empire in the ascendancy. And what empires in the ascendancy do is spread out and colonize everywhere else. We did that when the West did that, when we were the empire in the ascendancy. Now it will be done to us. We will be colonized by China. and we're not going to like it any more than the people we colonized. So this is where the future is going. In this part of the world, we will be under the thumb of China. And the alliances that the US had built up are being destroyed. That was another aspect of what people who put Trump in power wanted him to do. They did not put him in power because they liked him. They put him in power to destroy America. And that's exactly what he's been doing for 4 years. So they want him to stay there because they want him to keep doing that. And it isn't going to work. But these are very transactional people. And the people who've been supporting him, they will just as easily work with somebody else because they were never about a relationship with Trump. They were just about put in the chaos agent to wreck the country. But they know perfectly well that they need to work with the legitimate administration, so they will. So Trump is going to find he's not going to get the kind of welcome as a king abroad that he might have been expecting, because they'll drop him and he won't have any use for them anymore if he's not in power. So there are a whole lot of factors that are coming up globally, and America's only part of it. I'm interested in America partly because this is the cornerstone of the Western alliance, the cornerstone of what protects liberal democracy. And if America goes down in terms of no longer being a liberal democracy, well, it's a republic, not a liberal democracy anyway, but it was a kind of democratic republic. Once that goes down, I think the other dominoes will fall. So we won't end up with liberal democracy in very many places. I would say probably in 25 years, I'd be surprised if there was a single liberal democracy anywhere on the face of the earth, which is really sad. But that's exactly what you expect during times of contraction. During times of expansion, you get more and more and more liberal democracies because you build up trust, and trust is what's required for liberal democracy. Because if you have trust, then you can set up a system of rules. People will trust the rules, and they will play that game according to the rules. They only do that when they trust those rules, when they trust those rules are in the common interest. As soon as they no longer feel those rules are in the common interest, then they stop following them. And then you don't have political legitimacy anymore. And without legitimacy, you cannot have democracy. If nobody trusts in the rules, those rules will not be how elections are conducted. They'll be conducted according to the rules of raw power. And that's what we're already seeing in America now, and to some extent in other places too. So these are definitely my concerns, that you've got exactly the wrong kind of politics at the worst possible time to deal with limits to growth. At the very time when you most need really competent leadership and trust in that leadership, you get exactly the opposite. And so you just end up with leaders who make everything worse all the way down, try to grab everything for their group of people and exclude everybody else. It's us versus them. And the us gets tighter and tighter in terms of definition as to who is like us, and everybody else gets left out in the cold. And these tight-knit groups can get more and more and more tight-knit over time. This is where I see QAnon going. I think they're going to become extremely self-reinforcing, and it will morph into an official religion, I believe. So I think it's going to be the next big religious movement globally will be QAnon. And I hate to see how they manage to make any kind of coherent religion out of it, because it just doesn't make any sense. It's insane.
Well, and you've talked about QAnon quite a bit in other calls that we've had, and I'd like to point out for the viewers that we have had a number of calls all of 2020 almost, and so you are
50 hours worth, I think, now.
Yeah, and you're welcome to look. You're all welcome to look back at the playlist, either the Deep Shock playlist or Nicole Foss has a playlist on the Local Future channel. So if you just go to YouTube and type in Local Future, it should come up as your top hit. And then I think those playlists are right toward the top. And I need to wrap us up here because we've been on a long call today. So thank you so much, Nicole, for coming on the call. We really appreciate it. Again, all the way from New Zealand. And
well, I'm happy to be here.
And I think, you know, it's interesting to listen and to consider, you know, what is the future going to be like? You know, if this is my family and I recently watched A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens.
Oh, yes.
A version called Scrooge out of 1941, I believe. And in this version, Scrooge is rather, he is quickly turned to seeing the ills of his ways. I think on the second or third spirit, he's starting to get pretty understanding what he needs to do. But it's that third spirit, you know, the spirit of Christmas yet to come, and seeing what it might be like if people are complacent, and if people continue to be comfortable in their social media bubbles, and if they continue to be happy on their autopilot brains, and if they aren't aware of greedy people like the billionaires, the Princes and the DeVosses and the Myers and all those others who are just Scrooges in their own right, you know. So I think listening to this sort of this might be the way it will go. We've seen it go this way in other places and other times, and we need to be vigilant to keep our positive future for ourselves and our posterity.
Yes, I mean, there are tons of things people can do. Absolutely, maintaining community is huge.
All right, well, thank you so much again, Nicole, and we will see you in the future. And I think on a future show, we would really like to dig deep. And even though the virus and politics is such a huge thing, we're going to try to set that aside on a future show and focus on the other side of the coin. It's the same coin, really, but things like the stock market and the pension funds and economic bubbles and housing bubbles and the you know, the stimulus bubbles, Federal Reserve and interest rates and all those sorts of things. And maybe we can set that aside and try to keep out the it's difficult to keep out the politics, and it's difficult to keep out the everything else. But I think on a future show, we will attempt to do that, and we'll make sure to label that in the description and the title.
Okay.
So, and thank everyone for viewing. Please do a thumbs up. Feel free to add a comment. We do our best to read those and respond to those. And have a good one. Wonderful December to you.